Welcome to History Lost in Time, from one enthusiast to others.
And welcome to episode 12. In this episode I will talk about the Heinkel He-51, a fighter and close support aircraft of the interwar period that saw a lot of combat in the Spanish Civil War.
Why this topic today?
Same as with the episodes about the Heinkel close support aircraft, I like introducing unknown aircraft that shouldn't be forgotten in my opinion. That may not be good for search algorithms, because nobody looks up these aircraft, but well, who would benefit from the 10 millionth video about the Me-109? That also doesn't help with the algorithm.
Political background and commentary.
None. I am simply enthusiastic about anything that can fly. Politics doesn't have much to do with that.
The sources.
Okay, so when it comes to my sources, maybe politics are involved after all. The hard data about the He-51 can be gathered from Wikipedia. Not a problem, the career of that aircraft isn't controversial at all. I'll get extra information from two books. Adolf Galland, Die Ersten und die Letzten, translation The First and the Last, published by Franz Schneeklut Verlag KG München 1953, and Das Buch der Spanienflieger, translation The Book of the Spain Pilots, published by Hauptmann Wulf Bley and Verlag von Hase und Köhler, Leipzig 1939. Adolf Galland was a Luftwaffe fighter pilot from 1940 to 45. Before that he flew close support aircraft including the He-51. During World War II he mostly flew the Me-109, mainly in the Western theater of war. He participated in the Western campaign of 1940, the Battle of Britain and later the defense of the Reich. By the end of the war he flew the Me-262 jet fighter in the Jagdverband 44. He tried to stay active after the war and served as an advisor to the Argentinian Air Force. He did not join the post-war West German Luftwaffe, instead he worked in the industry. In 1969 he was a historical advisor for the movie Battle of Britain. The Spain Pilots book was published in 1939 in Germany, just as the secrecy about the Condor Legion was lifted. So the book is Nazi propaganda and glorification of the Luftwaffe to some degree. However, one can still get some information from it regarding the He-51. Ernst Heinkel had already worked in aircraft development during World War I. During World War II, his Heinkel Aircraft Company developed and produced some of the most successful German combat aircraft of World War II. The He-51 was an improved version of the He-49, which had its first flight in 1932 and was rejected by the Luftwaffe. The improved He-51 had its first flight in 1933, was accepted and arrived at the Luftwaffe squadrons in summer of 1934. By 1937, about 700 aircraft had been produced. When the Luftwaffe became public in 1935, the He-51 was basically part of its initial equipment. However, it was quickly replaced as a fighter, first by the Arado 68 in 1936 and by the Me-109 in 1937. It remained in service as a close support aircraft. Let's take a look at the technical data. The He-51B1 had a length of 8.4 meters, a height of 3.2 meters and a wingspan of 11 meters. It was still a biplane, so it looked somewhat dated by the late 1930s. However, considering it was developed in the early 1930s, it was okay. The undercarriage couldn't be raised. Empty weight was about 1.5 tons, takeoff weight was around 1.9 tons. The aircraft was powered by a BMW 6 engine that produced 750 horsepower. This engine proved to be very reliable according to First Lieutenant Keller, who says this in the Spain Pilots book on page 116. Top speed was 330 km per hour or 205 miles per hour. Cruise speed was 280 km per hour or 174 miles per hour. Maximum range was 570 kilometers or 354 miles. The service ceiling was 7,700 meters. The cockpit was open, so in this regard it was just like a fighter aircraft of World War I. The HE-51 was armed with two 7.92mm machine guns of the type MG-17, and it could carry up to 6 10-kilogram bombs. The 51 was a good aircraft, but not necessarily easy to fly. In the Spain pilot's book, Major Handrich admits on page 145 that young and inexperienced pilots had severe problems with the Heinkel. When the HE-51 arrived at the Condor Legion in Spain, she was initially superior to the Republican aircraft. However, when the Soviet Union sent modern aircraft like the Polikarpov I-15, which the Germans called Curtiss, the Polikarpov I-16 Rata, and the bomber Tupolev SB, which the Germans called Martin, the days of air supremacy for the HE-51 were over. It was relegated to close support duty, while the more modern Me-109 took over as a fighter. The Tupolev SB had a top speed of 450 km per hour or 280 miles per hour, which was a lot faster than the HE-51 could fly. The single-decker Rata even reached 489 km per hour or 304 miles per hour. The older I-15, which like the Heinkel was a biplane, still reached 367 km per hour or 228 miles per hour. All of them outclassed the Heinkel. In his memoirs, Adolf Galland talks about the disadvantages the HE-51 had when confronted with its Soviet opponents. The HE-51 was clearly inferior to the Curtiss and the Rata, both in speed and armament, as well as in maneuverability and rate of climb. In other words, in virtually all the characteristics that determine the quality of a fighter aircraft. We therefore had to avoid dogfights with enemy fighters whenever possible and focus exclusively on ground targets. We therefore called ourselves narrow-track fighters with friendly self-irony. Nevertheless, dogfights with the Curtiss and the Rata could not always be avoided. It always became a tricky affair. In the Spain pilot's book, Captain Freiherr von Huwald confirms this on page 21. The seriousness of the situation suddenly became quite clear to us. Our good old HE-51 was too slow compared to the new Ratas, and the latter were outpacing us. It was hard to believe. They could play with us if they wanted, and then there were the Soviet Martin bombers, of which there were getting more every day. Even the Martin bombers were at least 50 kilometers faster than us. The way the HE-51 was designed and used was more or less the exact same way that fighters were used in World War I. Galland explains that on page 48. Our armament and equipment was relatively primitive at the time. We generally flew without radios. It was considered an unnecessary luxury, especially since they didn't work well yet. We flew by sight and communicated by signal. Our HE-51 carried a total of 6 10-kilogram fragmentation bombs in the fuselage. It was armed with 2 machine guns, which weren't electro-pneumatically loaded and triggered with a simple push of a button, as would later become standard practice, but had to be manually loaded almost after every burst. This often resulted in bloody knuckles on various obstacles in the cramped and incredibly hot cockpit and profuse sweating. So on hot days we flew wearing only swimming trunks, and when we returned from missions, sweating, smeared with oil and blackened by gunpowder smoke, we looked very much like coal trimmers. In order to increase the effectiveness of their aircraft, these soldiers got rather creative. On page 49, Galland describes the development of an improved bomb for close support missions. My mechanics also invented a kind of precursor to today's napalm bomb. They mounted an incendiary and a fragmentation bomb on a jettisonable gasoline container filled with fuel or mixture of gasoline and used engine oil. These bombs spread the fuel and ignited it after it landed on the ground. All this was very primitive, but by no means without effect. However, strafing runs were not material for heroic stories. They were brutal close-quarters fights for life and death on both sides. Captain Harder describes in relatively blunt and direct form on page 96 of the Spain pilot's book how a strafing run could look like. One morning we hit particularly favorable targets. The enemy appears to be preparing a major attack. After the initial approach at an altitude of about 400 meters, I see a large column of troops and many mules, barely deployed in a relatively small space. The troops are lying flat on the ground, the mules tied together, restless. What does feeling mean in war? We fire until the belts are empty and our cluster bombs are dropped in neat rows. A mule with a water cart is standing on the road. A short burst of fire, and as I pull up, I see it fall over with its cart. You can almost hear it clatter. These are our targets. However, the Republican Spanish weren't passive. They adapted constantly to their enemies. Air defense became better and better. The 20mm guns in particular became a menace to the close support aircraft. However, attacking air defense gun positions was standard practice for close support aircraft in order to make life easier for attacking bombers. Out of 93 HE-51s that were deployed in Spain, 46 were lost. The surviving aircraft were transferred to the Spanish and used by them until 1952. 2 HE-51s were captured by the Republican forces and transferred to the Soviet Union for study. The HE-51s that remained in Germany became advanced trainers for fighter pilots and were used in this role until the end of the war. However, their numbers dropped quickly. While the Luftwaffe still had 266 HE-51s in spring of 1940, by autumn of 1944 that number had dropped to just 8. In World War II, the HE-51 only saw combat as a close support aircraft during the invasion of Poland in 1939. The HE-51 was not just flown by Germany and Spain, but also by Bulgaria. The Bulgarians received 12 of them in 1936. Finishing words. The Heinkel HE-51 is one of the forgotten aircraft of the Luftwaffe. It didn't have a long career as a fighter, but it did have some impact as a close support aircraft in the Spanish Civil War and later as an advanced trainer. This was the aircraft that the close support pilots used to develop the tactics that they used during World War II. It is likely that most German fighter pilots of World War II flew a HE-51 at one point or another. That alone should be reason enough to not completely forget this aircraft. Thank you for your interest.